Hey, what's up? It's Clayton here from HowToDrawComics.net. What I'll be sharing with you here in today's video is some insight behind my digital inking process. I'll be covering things such as the graphics application and the brushes I use within it, how I use them to get super fine details rendered into the artwork, and at the same time, how I'm able to produce work to a high level of detail within a reasonable amount of time. So first up, this illustration is for the new proportions lesson coming from HowToDrawComics.net beginning of February. And in this chapter, I really wanted to highlight how the proportions of your characters are affected when they're posed in perspective. It's a tricky subject to teach and to learn, which is probably why proportions in perspective aren't really touched on all that much. It's definitely something they don't cover a lot in art school. But I really wanted to include it in the proportions lesson just because it's such a core fundamental must know when it comes to drawing comic books specifically. And a lot of people struggle with it, myself included, because it can almost seem like as soon as you place your characters in a more dynamic pose, proportions get thrown out of the window. Now in actual fact, they still very much apply. Just because someone looks at you from a different perspective that isn't straight on doesn't mean that your size and the scale of your body parts actually change. Visually to them, yes, but in reality, no. This is really when proportions become more of a guide to help you along the way rather than a hard and fast rule. Anyway, for those of you who are interested, I'll give you a little more info about the proportions lesson later in this video, just to clear up some of the questions I've received about it. But for now, what I'd like you to notice is how rough the underlying sketch in front of you actually is, the one I'm inking over. Now, this is actually a recent thing I've started doing that has at least doubled the speed of my workflow, and I want to share with you exactly what and why that is. See, I'm what I like to call an OCD perfectionist when it comes to drawing. Seriously, there have been times when I've thrown out 13 to 14 hours of work just because I changed my mind or I didn't like the direction an artwork was heading in. So as you can imagine, before I even used to give inking a second thought, I had to perfect my pencils to the nth degree. In fact, people would often remark on how blown away they were by my inks, not knowing that they were actually still the pencils that I was working on. Now, back then, when I eventually got round to inking the artwork, it took about the same amount of time as penciling it in the first place. So I was literally retracing over lines I'd already laid down, making the amount of time it took to complete something twice as long as it takes now. Something had to be done because the amount of time it was taking to turn a piece like this out was horrid. Instead of 3 hours, which is about the same amount of time I spent on inking this lovely lady real time, it'd take 6, and I'm not joking. So I decided to just cut out the middleman, take the sketch to a semi-discernible level, then wrap up the final liner with the inks from there. The important part was getting the foundation solid, so the pose, placement, perspective, and proportions of the character. I had to at least have those elements down to make sure the final line art had a good chance of not turning out to be a dud. From there, the real challenge was gaining the confidence to ink the final artwork without ironclad pencils. It all had to be polished and refined by the inks alone. And you know what? It was pretty damn tough to make the transition. Come to think of it, I think I gave up on doing it for a while and chickened out completely, until I inevitably had no choice thanks to the ever-looming commission deadlines I had on my back. I knew it'd be like anything else though, practice and repetition. That's the key to building confidence, speed, and ultimately skill. A week or so later, I totally had it in the bag, and I'm still mastering it like everybody else of course, but there were a few major transitions from penciling to straight inking I do want to highlight here, just so you know what to watch out for if you'd like to follow suit. The first major difference was brush size. I use Manga Studio for most of my penciling and inking work. The brushes aren't anything fancy, just the default pencil and G-Pen Manga Studio ships with. Actually, if you are looking to buy Manga Studio, they've changed their name now to, I think it's Clip Studio. So I'll put a link to that in the description of this video if you'd like to check it out. So back to the pencil and inking brushes I'm using here. Both behave quite differently. The reason for this is because the guys who created Manga Studio have emulated the feel of using an actual pencil and pen really, really well. So in the same way that you'll apply different pressures to a traditional pencil and pen to get certain thicknesses in your lines, you'll find this is the same case in Manga Studio. This was a bit of a challenge at first, just because I was so used to using the pencil tool exclusively. I had to experiment a little bit, applying different amounts of pressure to the pen tool to get the same line thicknesses I'd previously been able to get with the pencil tool. The pencil tool in Manga Studio doesn't actually require a whole lot of pressure, unless you're looking for darker tones. It has a kind of blunt feel to it. The pen tool, however, is a lot more sharp and precise, and you do have to press down if you want to thicken up your lines. A quick fix here, if you don't really want to grind the stylus into your tablet to get bolder lines, is just to make the size of your brush bigger. And that's easy to do. You just use the brace keys near the top right hand side of your keyboard to scale it up and down. Alright, now the second major obstacle I ran into was, for some reason, I naturally started sketching out my inked lines. This made the contours look frayed and, as a result, were much less smooth and streamlined. So I really had to make an effort to lay those lines down in a single stroke. I'm still not perfect with this, especially on longer lines. I do tend to construct them using multiple strokes. Same goes for adding line weights and thickening up those contours. The difference is now I'm much better at keeping them nice and smooth regardless. Another question that comes up fairly often is how I manage to get such intricate line work and fine details in the finished illustration. Now, I kind of stumbled across this while I was experimenting with different amounts of pressure and brush sizes. But in general, the secret is to keep your brush size super small. You can see on the screen here how the little line that runs around the circumference of the brush is tiny in comparison to the rest of the canvas. And it'll get even smaller than that when rendering in different tones and finishing touches. I'd encourage you to experiment for yourself though, because honestly, you and I are going to use these tools in our own unique way at the end of the day to get the results we're after. You really have to get your own feel for it. I personally have a very tight grip on my stylus most of the time, and I do suffer for it a little. In fact, I recently had to wrap a few of my fingers up in tissues and bandages to help cushion them, and that was in addition to the magnetic wristband I've got to wear every time I sit down to draw to make sure I've got enough blood flowing through my arm. I know it's crazy how much we suffer for our art sometimes, but my motto is, draw as much as you can while you can. Now, one more piece of advice I'd like to share with you that'll also come into play when it comes to speeding up your inking process is how much you zoom in while you work. You'll notice that the canvas in front of you is pretty much sized up to the same resolution as my monitor. I'm literally inking the artwork from this distance as you can see it. So I've really got to pay attention to all those tiny details to make sure they translate correctly at this size. The reason I can get away with it though is because the resolution of the proportions lesson I'll be including this in is 1920 by 1080. The same resolution as my monitor. In other words, it'll never really be viewed any bigger than what you're seeing it here. However, if this was to be printed out on a poster or inside a comic book, I'd probably have to zoom in a lot more to make sure the lines I was inking would come out nice and crisp in that format. But here's the general rule of thumb, size to time ratio. The more zoomed in you are while you're working, the longer it'll take you to complete it. And vice versa, the more zoomed out you are, the less time you'll spend on it. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because if you've magnified your canvas to cram as much detail in as possible into your illustration, the lines you have to lay down are going to get much longer in length. So say I was to zoom into this artwork, for example, by about 50%. In theory, it'd take about twice as long to wrap up. So you really have to think about what the end product is going to be and what your illustration is going to be used for. If I was to print this out on an A3 sized poster, it'd probably have a whole lot of messy, wobbly lines that just aren't visible from this distance. And that's fine for me because it'll only ever be seen at this resolution. I mean, hey, it still probably wouldn't be that bad a quality in all honesty, because the resolution of the image itself is still quite high. But it's something to think about. When it comes to drawing comics, there's always a balance between quality and quantity, and sometimes you've got to make the hard decisions when there's a deadline to fulfill. Even the pros talk about this. I remember seeing a post from Todd McFarlane where he talked about how he'd cover up undone artwork or flaws using shadows or taking shortcuts to get the job done. See, comics is an art form, but it's also a business. Okay, so I mentioned this sword-wielding vixen will be included in the upcoming proportions lesson from howtodrawcomics.net. This segment of the lesson, as you can probably guess from the wacky perspective I've drawn her on, actually deals with keeping the proportions of your characters intact, even when drawing them in perspective. The whole lesson is packed with comic book illustrations just like this one that I've created to help highlight each of the covered topics. I've recorded the making of all of them too so that I can package them up and give them to you with the lesson once it's released. I know that seeing how each of these illustrations is created can be incredibly valuable for those of you who are eager to see how a comic book illustration is constructed in its entirety from the ground up. Now, there's been a few of you write in about the proportions lesson. And look, it's no wonder because this thing has been about 4 months in the making. So I wanted to address some of those questions here while at the same time skim over the details of what's included in the lesson itself for those of you who are interested in getting your character proportions handled once and for all. So why proportions? Why is this the first lesson you're getting from howtodrawcomics.net? So I've been teaching classes for over half a decade now, and one of the struggles I've seen in 99% of my students is going through the struggle of drawing their characters in proportion. They get frustrated, talk themselves down, and become discouraged, sometimes even depressed. They beat themselves up, and they just can't get their characters to look right, even though they were convinced that they were doing everything correctly. And heck, I empathize with them because this was one of the first things I struggled with when I first started learning how to draw. It's damn hard to get right. It's probably the first and biggest hurdle I had to overcome before making any real progress. Didn't matter how much I tried to hide it in the details or under the muscles, those pesky proportions always screwed things up. That was the real kicker, because proportions are such a fundamental building block in learning how to draw comic book characters. I wasn't actually able to make progress or move on to the other areas, such as anatomy, shadowing, or rendering, until I'd conquered proportions once and for all. It's the kind of thing where we look back on an old piece of artwork, and it's the flawed proportions that are always the first thing to make us cringe. This is why I helped my students draw their characters in proportion before they learned anything else, so that they could construct a proportionally accurate skeleton that they could build their characters on. Now, I did want to take these classes online for those of you overseas who can't be here in person, but because of my internet speed, streaming wasn't an option. So what I decided to do instead was to create a definitive downloadable lesson that covers absolutely everything you'll need to ever know about drawing your characters up to size correctly. It's not a live class, but the advantage is you've got it there on demand whenever you need it. And when I say it covers everything, I really do mean it covers everything. I'm talking the proportions of your regular superheroes and heroines, how the proportions of your characters change at different ages, classic character types that are recognizable in almost every single comic book out there today, a complete breakdown of the proportions of the human head, easy to remember proportional comparisons such as, how your foot is the same length as your forearm, and finally, how proportions are affected by posing your characters and foreshortening them in perspective. The reason I've packed so much into this lesson for you is because I really wanted to create something that you could refer back to over and over again. A single resource that you could draw upon without having to trawl through the internet or books that only included a fraction of what I've included in this lesson. Why? Because proportions aren't a technique, trick, or gimmick. They're a fundamental drawing principle that, once you learn, you can use as a foundation for creating comic book illustrations that are proportionally accurate purely from your imagination. Now, the other main reason is this. what you'll find in this video, you're not going to find anywhere else. I know that for a fact because I've looked everywhere, just like you have, just like my students did before they had enrolled in my class. In books, on the internet, in actual art schools that cost a fortune to attend. The basics are out there, and yeah, there's some advanced principles scattered around if you really look hard enough and you've got the time and patience to scrape it all together. But there's nothing in depth that you can take with you now and replicate and apply and see immediate results. This is really something I've done because I've been asked over and over again to create a definitive collection of lessons that cover character creation. And this is where it all begins, at the very foundations that hold up a well-drawn comic book illustration. Now, some of you have asked if this is going to cost you anything. And the answer is yes, it's a high-quality premium lesson. However, I'll be giving you the first chapter completely free, which honestly stands on its own as one of the best lessons on proportions that is available. It covers the proportions of the heroic figure, comes with an ebook and proportions template that you'll be able to use as a reference for your characters. And of course, if you like the free lesson and you want to get into more advanced stuff, you'll have the premium lesson there to check out as well. Now, the full proportions lesson goes for a whole hour, and when you get to the end of it, there's an exercise that I'll take you through step by step that's going to help cement everything you've learned. As I said, the entire lesson is an hour long, and it's by far the most in-depth and comprehensive comic art training I've ever put together. And let me say why. Since 2010, I've taken it upon myself to teach hundreds of students how to draw dynamically so that no matter how complex the idea they want to create is, they're able to draw it down onto paper and share it with the world. Whether it be a conceptual design for video games, storyboarding, or comic book illustration. And honestly, over that time, I've fallen in love with teaching. It's been one of the most rewarding paths I've ever walked with my talent, even after having worked with multiple studios and clients. Nothing beats seeing the same glint of passion in the eyes of my students that I have when they see real results. So even though creating this proportions lesson has been no small task, it has been truly a worthwhile pursuit for me, and I'm grateful to be in a position where I can share it with you now. Anyway, I'm going to stop shamelessly promoting the proportions lesson right here, but I will say that I'm super excited for you to see it. I'll have more details coming up soon for it, so stay tuned. Oh, and by the way, there is a link at the bottom of this video in the description where, if you want to, you can sign up for an early access release of the lesson that comes with a couple of exclusive bonuses. Because of the bonuses, there is a cutoff limit, so if you think this sounds like it's for you, then head on over there now and just pop in your name and email. Now you might have noticed that this lovely lady had a compadre I'd sketched up earlier. I'll be inking her up in the next video, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends and remember to subscribe for more comic art tutorials. Until next time, keep on creating, and I'll see you later.